This chapter will cover the four main types of tissues that we have: epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscular tissue, and nervous tissue. In our body, we have approximately 75 trillion cells, and then when we have a group of cells that work together and to perform a similar function, this is called a tissue. And so again, we have four main tissue types where we have epithelial, connective, muscular, and nervous. Now there's a special branch of biology called histology, where this is now the study of tissues. And a lot of histology is used for different pathologies of diseases. The four main types of tissues that we have are epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous. So epithelial tissue covers surfaces, lines the inside of organs, as well as body cavities. Connective tissue is responsible for protection, binding together, and support of organs. Muscle tissue is important for facilitating movement of skeleton or other organ walls, such as with the smooth muscle in our digestive tract. And then finally, nervous tissue, we have two main types of cells that we find: neurons, which control activities and process information, and then glial cells, which help support and protect neurons. And so here we have an image of the four main tissue types. Now we'll go on further to extensively detail the branches of the different tissues. We'll begin with epithelial tissue and talk about epithelium as well. To reiterate, epithelial tissue, which the Greek word or Latin word for epi means upon, covers and lines every body surface and all body cavities. Also, it forms the external and internal linings of many organs, including a majority of glands. Epithelium, however, is composed of one or more layers of closely packed cells between two compartments having different components. Because of this, there is little or no extracellular matrix between epithelial cells. Extracellular matrix is composed of proteins, proteoglycans, and carbohydrates that help to bind cells together and give them support. Instead, epithelial tissue is attached to a layer of basal lamina, or a basement membrane, which is then underneath a layer of connective tissue, where connective tissue then has a majority of extracellular matrix. In addition, because of this, there are no blood vessels that penetrate through epithelium. The functions of epithelial tissue include physical protection, where epithelial tissue will protect our external surface, such as our skin, as well as internal surfaces, such as our organs. And epithelial tissue will then protect from dehydration, from abrasions, as well as any physical, chemical, or biological agents that have caused destruction to our epithelial tissues. The second function includes epithelial tissue to be selectively permeable, and so this tissue is commonly referred to as another gatekeeper because it regulates movements into and out of the body, and so this is important for difference in absorption and filtration and exclusion of different materials. So if we think of in the sense of our skin is going to be our first layer when we're exposed to external agents or materials, and then with each passing organ, each organ has its own set of epithelial tissue, which then it can regulate if that agent will enter or exit that organ or not. The third function of epithelial tissue is for secretion, and so commonly this is referred to as exocrine glands that are specialized to produce different secretions. We also have individual gland cells that then are important for our endocrine glands. And so there they can produce different secretions such as hormones, different proteins that can then be sent out to the rest of the body. And then lastly, we have different sensation that epithelial tissue has, because epithelial tissue also has nerve endings within to detect different changes of the external environment. So for instance, our skin, we have different nerve endings that are responsive to temperature, to pressure changes, to vibration, as well as light and deep touch. And several organs also contain a specialized epithelium called neuroepithelium, and this is where we have a lot of nerve endings that can sense sight, taste, sound, smell, as well as equilibrium, such as within our vestibular system in our ear. All epithelia exhibit several common characteristics that they all share. So the first is cellularity. And so epithelial tissue are composed almost entirely of cells where they contain little or no extracellular matrix. And so due to this reason, again, epithelia is considered to be avascular because they are interconnected to cells rather than extracellular matrix that separates cells. The second is polarity. And so every epithelium has an apical surface, which is the free or the top surface. And this is where the epithelia is exposed to either an external environment or to some internal body space. There's also a lateral surface, which is to the side, and the epithelia cells then have the intracellular junctions where they connect to several other epithelial cells. And thirdly, there is a basal surface, which is the fixed or the bottom surface, where the epithelia is attached to an underlying layer of connective tissue, commonly referred to as the basement membrane. And so the basement membrane then is connected to the connective tissue below it. Again, epithelia is avascular, meaning that it has no blood vessels, and so due to this reason, the epithelial cells either get their nutrients directly from their apical or their top surface, or by diffusion across the basal surface at their basal level. All epithelia are innervated, and so this is important for detection of differences of changes in the external environment. And again, this is due to the nervous tissue and free nerves that are around. And finally, regeneration. Because epithelia have the apical surface is exposed to the environment, there is frequent damage or loss due to abrasion. And so just as fast as epithelia disintegrate, they can replace themselves as fast due to the high metabolic or mitotic functions. And this is due to the stem cells, which are found in the deepest layer of the epithelium. Here in this image of an epithelium, what we have first is this apical or free surface that again is the top layer of the epithelial cell. And again, this is where it's exposed to the external environment, or it is exposed to some internal body space. Our lateral surface is going to be to the sides of the epithelial cells, where this is where we find our intracellular junctions, where then we have communication between neighboring epithelial cells. And then finally, we have our basal surface, which is, again, our bottom surface, which then is attached to our basement membrane. So the basement membrane is actually responsible for physical protection of epithelium, and it also anchors epithelium to the connective tissue below it. So we have a layer of epithelium, a layer of actually 3 layers of basement membrane, and then finally a layer of connective tissue. So to point out again too, our blood vessels are found in the layer below our epithelium in connective tissue, where epithelium does not have blood vessels. So some specialized surface features of some, but not all epithelial include microvilli. Microvilli, again, are going to be small finger-like extensions that are responsible for increasing surface area. We find a lot of microvilli within our digestive system, such as within our small intestine, and their purpose is to increase surface area to absorb nutrients so that the food we eat can be ingested and digested. Cilia tend to be longer, finger-like extensions, and commonly we find this within our respiratory system, where here we would have a surrounding layer of mucus that would help to move oxygen and other molecules and waste products along, either away or to our lungs. And so here in this image, what we have are our microvilli, and then here we would have cilia. So you can see the difference of the size between the two. And finally, we have our intracellular junctions that are found between the lateral surfaces of epithelial cells. Because epithelial cells are avascular, this allows for diffusion and communication between epithelial cells so that there's a cohesive transport of information and molecules between the epithelial tissue. There are three main arrangement types for epithelial tissue. The first is simple epithelium, and so this is where we have just one single layer of cells. Typically, this is found in areas where stress is minimal and where filtration, absorption, or secretion is the primary function, so allow for rapid movement of these molecules or material. So common areas that we find simple epithelium is within the air sacs of the lungs, within the intestines, and as well as in blood vessels. Again, minimal risk of exposure to any threat, however, need for rapid diffusion of materials. The second is a stratified epithelium, where we have two or more layers of epithelial cells, and sometimes this looks like a brick wall that stagger throughout, and it can have anywhere from 2 to 2,000 layers. Stratified epithelium is strong and it's capable of resistance to stress and to any threats from the environment. So this is also important for protection of underlying tissue because of the multiple layers. Areas that we find this within the body include the esophagus, the pharynx, and the vagina, where these are subject to abrasive activities or to mechanical stress. Thirdly, we have pseudo-stratified or fake stratified, where it looks layered. However, all the cells are attached to a basement membrane. Now, not all of these cells will reach the apical surface or the exposed surface. Those that do reach the exposed surface tend to have cilia and to help move mucus along. And so areas where we find this is within the nasal cavity and the respiratory passages. Not only can epithelial tissue be characterized by number of layers, but as well as the shape of the layers. So the first one is called a squamous shape. And so this is a flattened shape, right here, that resembles a fried egg. And because of this, the nucleus is also disc-shaped. These cells tend to be flat, wide, and usually irregular. The second is cuboidal, and so this represents like an ice cube shape, where cells are about as tall as they are wide. And then lastly, we have a columnar shape, where these cells tend to be taller than they are wide. And so these resemble either a column or a pillar. Now these are considered to be the three most commonly observed shapes within epithelial tissue. However, there's one special type called transitional where it looks like ice cream scoops. And so these are found in very rare areas, such as within the bladder, where they can undergo lots of stretching and bending due to, or such as when the bladder is filled with urine or not. And so with transitional, these cells also are attached to just one single, or to the basement membrane. Take a moment now to look at this picture of an epithelial tissue and determine the cell layer number and the cell layer type. If you said stratified squamous epithelium, you're exactly right. And what we have is, because we have multiple layers of cells, and here we would have our basal surface that is then attached to our basement membrane, where all of this is connective tissue. And if we look at the apical surface of these cells, we find that they have a flattened appearance in general, and so this would be our squamous feature. And so this picture actually is an image from an esophagus. Glands are specialized organs or cells that are composed predominantly of epithelial tissue. And interestingly, these are actually invaginations that were formed when we were all in our mother's womb in utero as we were embryos. And the invaginations then lie within the connective tissue, where the purpose of glands are to either produce substances that can either be used elsewhere in the body or for elimination from the body. And so a lot of our secretions include mucin, hormones, enzymes, as well as waste products. There are two main classifications of glands. We have endocrine and exocrine glands, and the way that they are distinguished is by if they have a duct connecting the secretory cells to the surface of an epithelium or not. And so endocrine glands lack ducts, and then they secrete their products directly from the fluids within cells and within the bloodstream itself. These secretions of endocrine glands are called hormones that then act as chemical messengers to influence cells within the body. Exocrine glands, however, are originated from an invagination of epithelium that's found deep within connective tissue. And so they maintain their contact with epithelial surfaces by a duct. And so from that duct then, they can secrete molecules or materials to the surface of skin. So this is where we have a lot of our sweat from sweat glands and milk from mammary glands, or we find it into directly epithelial surfaces lining internal passageways, where we find enzymes from the pancreas into the small intestine, or another example is saliva from the salivary gland into the oral cavity. And so again, the only difference is if one has a duct, which then would be the exocrine gland, and one that does not have a duct, which would be the exocrine gland, or endocrine gland, as it's directly found within epithelial tissue. Every gland is formed by an ingrowth from an epithelial surface. So here in this image, what we have is our line of our epithelial cells. And then what we have is an ingrowth beginning, where we'll have multiple layers, so it goes from simple to stratified layers, where then we have this invagination that begins, and this ingrowth may form from the beginning process of a tubular structure. And so here we begin our tubular structure. In other instances, though, glands can start as a solid column of cells, which then just subsequently become invaginated. So the difference now between our exocrine and our endocrine is that the endocrine or exocrine gland retains its duct to body surfaces. Endocrine glands, however, during development lose their duct and subsequently their contact to surfaces, and then they become isolated as small blocks of tissues. Thus, these are considered to be ductless glands. The second tissue, connective tissue, is the most diverse, abundant, widely distributed, and microscopically variable of all the tissues. The purpose of connective tissue is to support, protect, and bind organs together. It is the glue that binds body structures together. Connective tissue includes fibrous tendons and ligaments, body fat, cartilage that connects the ends of ribs to the sternum, the bones of the skeleton, and blood, to name a few. All connective tissue share three basic components, yet they are very diverse. It depends on the type of cell, the protein fiber, and the ground substance that composes the connective tissue. The diversity among the connective tissues themselves is due to the various proportions of these three components as to the differences in types and amounts of protein fibers as well. The three different characteristics of connective tissue that aid in the diversity include the cells that comprise it, the protein fibers that are for the strength and support, as well as the ground substance for the non-living component. So the cell types all depend on what type of connective tissue is specific to that cell. So for example, fat contains adipocytes, bone contain osteocytes, and cells that are not in direct contact with each other but are scattered throughout tissues. This is completely different than epithelium, where those cells were all next to each other and tightly packed in. Now the protein fibers aid in strength and support for connective tissue, and the type and abundance of these fibers will then indicate to what extent the particular connective tissue is responsible for how much strength and for how much support. So the main protein fibers that we find is collagen, which is for strength and stretch resistance, elastic, which is responsible for flexibility and resilience, and the reticular fibers, which are important for the formation of the framework. And so here are examples of different protein fibers that we find. And so the thinnest would be our elastic. Then the thicker one would be our reticular. And then finally the thickest one would be our collagen. Lastly, we have ground substance found in connective tissue. And again, this is a non-living material primarily composed of proteins and carbohydrates and different amounts of water based on its location. So, for instance, within the blood, ground substance could be viscous. Within cartilage, it could be semi-solid. And within bone, it's found to be solid. The ground substance, along with protein fibers, then makes the extracellular matrix that we find in all connective tissue. The various functions of connective tissue include protection. So with bones, these help to protect our delicate organs. So for instance, our cranium helps to protect our organ of the brain, the sternum helps to protect the organ of the heart, and then the thoracic cage will protect the organ of the lungs. Also, fat is responsible for protection, especially around our kidneys, and the posterior side of our eyes within our skull. Next, we have the support and structural framework, where bones provide the framework for the adult body and support our soft tissues. Cartilage supports body structures, especially during development, as well as other organs such as the trachea, bronchi, the ears, and the nose. Also, connective tissue sheets form capsules to support body organs. This is especially true for the spleen and the kidneys. Next, we have binding of structures, where ligaments are responsible for binding bone to bone, tendons are responsible for binding bone to muscle, and then we have dense, irregular connective tissue that is responsible for binding skin to underlying muscle and bone. Next, we have the function of storage, where fat will be a primary energy reserve for the body, and bone will be a large reservoir for calcium and for phosphorus for the body. Next, we have transport of fluids and dissolved materials, where blood will carry out nutrients, gases, hormones, waste, and blood cells between different regions of the body. Our lymph and our lymphatic system are also responsible for carrying out waste products and providing antibodies to regions where we need our defense mechanisms activated. And so this leads into defenses against microorganisms. So we have immune protection, where we have white blood cells, or our leukocytes, which are responsible for protecting against diseases and mount any immune response when the body is exposed to something foreign. Our macrophages are responsible for phagocytizing, or eating up, foreign molecules as well. Also, our extracellular matrix, again, that is found within connective tissue, provides this viscous material that then inhibits movement of different disease-causing organisms, especially with bacteria and viruses. So to help increase the attack from white blood cells in our immune system before getting into vital organs that could severely damage and compromise our bodies. Connective tissue proper includes types of connective tissue that have a variable mixture of both connective tissue cell types and different extracellular protein fibers that are suspended within a viscous ground substance. The differences between the connective tissue result from differences between the number and the types of cells, as well as the relative properties and proportions of the fibers to the ground substance. Supporting connective tissue is responsible for forming a strong, durable framework that protects and supports the soft body tissues. Two great examples of this are cartilage and bone, where the extracellular matrix in the supporting connective tissue contains many protein fibers and ground substance that ranges from semi-solid, such as with cartilage, to solid, such as with bone. And finally, fluid connective tissue is composed of cells and cell fragments called formed elements. These formed elements are called erythrocytes, or red blood cells, leukocytes, or called white blood cells, and platelets. Erythrocytes, or red blood cells, are responsible for transporting oxygen and carbon dioxide between the lungs and the body tissue. Leukocytes, or white blood cells, are responsible for initiation during an immune response, and then they respond to different foreign pathogens, such as bacteria, viruses, fungi, and parasites, where they will destroy them. And then finally, platelets are also involved for blood clotting. Lymph is formed when there is interstitial fluid, which is the fluid inside of body tissues, and there is an excess that is collected. The purpose of lymph is to return proteins and excess interstitial fluid back into circulation so that there is not a loss within vital tissues. Also, a major role for lymph is that it picks up bacteria in the bloodstream, and then it brings it to the lymph nodes where then the bacteria can be destroyed. There are two main classes of cells found within connective tissue proper. The first one are resident cells, which these are permanently contained within the connective tissue. So think of resident, they reside within the connective tissue. And their responsibility is to help support, maintain, and repair the extracellular matrix. Wandering cells, on the other hand, move through the connective tissue and are mobile, and their involvement is to protect with the immune response. And so they repair damaged extracellular matrix. And so the number of wandering cells at any given moment will vary based on what is needed at a local area. Resident cells include fibroblasts, adipocytes, fixed macrophages, and mesenchymal cells. So what we have first are fibroblasts. And in this diagram, our fibroblasts are found right here. And so these cells are large, and they appear relatively flat under the microscope with tapered ends. And they are relatively abundant within the connective tissue, and their role is for wound healing when we're exposed to any type of wound. The second classification of resident cells are adipocytes, and these are also known as fat cells. And so these typically appear in small clusters. However, sometimes due to diet or lack of exercise, individuals may have more adipocyte tissue and adipocyte cells in certain areas compared to others. The third class of resident or fixed cells are fixed macrophages. And so in this diagram, here would be a fixed macrophage. And so these tend to be relatively large and irregular shaped with numerous surface folds and projections. So they're derived from leukocytes, in particular monocytes, a type of white blood cell, and they're dispersed throughout the extracellular matrix. Their role is like Pac-Man of all these cells, because what they do is they phagocytize damaged cells or pathogens. And so once they isolate a foreign invader, they release different chemicals, and then that will stimulate the immune system, and then so they will actually ingest and phagocytize that bacteria to prevent further damage for us. And then the last type of fixed cell is the mesenchymal cell. And so in this diagram, here is our mesenchymal cell. And so these are our embryonic stem cells, where their role is to be activated when there's local injury or damage to connective tissue. And so what happens is that these cells divide, where one cell will replace the fixed mesenchymal cell, and the second will actually go and scavenge to find what area is damaged and needs to be repaired. And so it will differentiate into whatever it needs to be to help that connective tissue cell repair. The types of wandering cells that we have are derived from leukocytes. And again, leukocytes are white blood cells. So their role is to scavenge throughout the bloodstream as well as throughout the connective tissue and help us overcome any illness or fight off foreign invaders that we might be exposed to. So for these we have mast cells, plasma cells, free macrophages, as well as other leukocytes. And so mast cells are found in this diagram right here. And these are relatively small, and they are mobile because they are wandering cells. They have this granular appearance within their cytoplasm, and they tend to be close to blood vessels because they are important for releasing heparin to help initiate blood clotting, and then histamine to help dilate blood vessels and increase blood flow when needed. Next we have plasma cells, and so for this diagram, this would be our plasma cell. and their role is in conjunction with B lymphocytes. They produce antibodies for us. And antibodies are important for synthesizing proteins that will attack certain diseases. And so antibodies are important for attaching foreign material and preventing it from causing further damage to our body, so that it, instead of binding to something that we actually need, antibodies will bind to these foreign proteins and get rid of them. And so we tend to find a lot of plasma cells within the intestinal wall, our spleen, and then within our lymph nodes. Next, we have free macrophages. And so for this example, here would be a free macrophage, where these again are mobile, and they also are like Pac-Man, where they are phagocytic, and they destroy bacteria that is found within the bloodstream. And so they're formed from a certain type of white blood cell, the monocyte, and again, they eat up that bacteria or any foreign molecule and then migrate it out of the connective tissue into the bloodstream where it can be disposed of. And then finally we have other leukocytes, where here in this figure is our diagram of a leukocyte. And these are wandering throughout the connective tissue, as well as migrating through the blood vessel walls into connective tissue, where then that's where they spend most of their time. And most of these leukocytes, such as neutrophils, are responsible for phagocytizing bacteria. Again, just to prevent foreign materials to be within our connective tissue. And so their purpose is just to destroy and attack foreign material. The main fibers of connective tissue proper are collagen, elastic, and reticular. The fibroblasts are actually those cells that are responsible for synthesizing the components of all three fiber types, and then they secrete additional protein subunits into the interstitial fluid to make up the individual fibers themselves. So collagen is the first fiber, and it's the most abundant protein that we have in our body, which makes up 25% of all of our protein found within our body. These fibers tend to be long, unbranched, extracellular fibers that are composed of the protein collagen. So they are strong, flexible, and they're resistant to stretching. And so for this picture, we have our collagen fibers being these larger white fibers. And these tend to be white in figures because under the microscope they also tend to have a white appearance when they're stained. And also they tend to have a wavy appearance as well. So the next protein fiber is elastic fiber, and these are thinner than collagen fibers because they contain the protein elastin. They are responsible for stretching easily, to be able to branch out, to rejoin, and then they appear also to be very wavy under the microscope. They have this coiled structure, and then because of this coiled structure, it allows for constant stretching and recoiling, such as a rubber band when its deforming force is withdrawn. And the great thing about this is that it allows skin, lungs, and arteries to return back to normal after being stretched out. And so for personal experience, especially being pregnant, it allows for the skin to come back to its original shape. And so in this picture, we have our elastic fibers right here. And so they're, as you can see, a lot thinner than the collagen fibers. And then finally we have reticular fibers. And so these are also thinner than the collagen fibers. However, they contain the same protein subunit as collagen, though how they differ is because they have a glycoprotein attached with it. And so to reiterate, glycoprotein, so these are proteins that have carbohydrates attached to them. And so what this does is it allows for an interwoven framework to occur due to the glycogens within the proteins. And this allows for a tough but flexible layer, and we find this within our lymph nodes, our spleen, and our liver. This allows for physical support of these organs and resistance to external forces that may damage the organ cells and blood vessels. In our picture here, this framework of the protein fibers would be our reticular layer. The ground substance of connective tissue proper tends to be a colorless, featureless, and viscous solution, and this is where we find the composition of the cellular and fibrous components that all collectively make up the ground substance. And so because of this, the ground substance tends to be a gelatinous and almost rubbery consistency due to the mixture of components of the proteins, carbohydrates, as well as additional salts and waters that are found within this mixture. And the amount of proteins and carbohydrates then will vary in the size and the mixture composition of the ground substance depending on the location of the connective tissue. Loose connective tissue is a broad category of connective tissue proper. And loose connective tissue tends to have fewer cells and protein fibers than dense connective tissue, which we'll talk about next. And so this is considered to be the packing material of the body because it occupies the spaces between and around organs. And so its function is to support the overlying epithelia and provide cushioning around organs, support around blood vessels and nerves, and store lipids. There are three types of loose connective tissue. The first is areolar connective tissue, and this is highly variable in appearance, and it's the least specialized of the connective tissues within the body. It has this loosely organized array of collagen and elastin fibers, and its abundant distribution of blood vessels. Areolar connective tissue also contains all of the cell types of connective tissue proper, both resident and wandering, but the predominant cell is the fibroblast. The ground substance accounts for most of the volume of the areolar connective tissue. And it's important for independent movements. So for instance, when you tug on your skin of your leg, you're able to grab the superficial layer just of the areolar connective tissue where you don't necessarily affect the underlying muscle. And so the areolar connective tissue is responsible for that. So we find this tissue everywhere within the body and predominantly around nerves, blood vessels, and individual muscle cells. And it's also a major component of subcutaneous layer that is deep to the skin. The second type of loose connective tissue is adipose connective tissue, and this is primarily composed of adipocytes or fat cells. This serves as the packing material that surrounds structures and provides padding, cushioning for shock absorption, as well as it acts as an insulator to slow down heat loss through our skin, which we notice this during winter. So adipose connective tissue is found throughout the bodies, and in diverse locations it might have a more substantial amount compared to other areas. So we find high amounts of adipose connective tissue around the kidneys, around the pericardium, as well as around the abdominal pelvic cavities and the subcutaneous layer of our skin. The responsibility for fat is that it serves as our primary energy storage for our body. And normally we find amounts of stored fat and the number of adipocytes that are quite stable in all individuals. While adipocytes are not able to divide, the mesenchymal cells, which again are stem cells of connective tissue, can provide additional fat cells when the body has excess nutrients. Because remember, mesenchymal cells can branch off and convert into whatever cell it needs to be. And so sometimes liposuction surgery doesn't work because while you get rid of all the adipose cells, you don't get rid of your mesenchymal cells, and so mesenchymal cells can then turn into adipose cells, thus creating fat and liposuction failing. Then our third, there is a picture of adipocytes, where they tend to have this globular appearance, and then the little dots of that we find, such as right here, these would be the nuclei of the cells. Alright, and then our last loose connective tissue is our reticular connective tissue. And so this, just like our reticular protein fibers, contains a meshwork of reticular fibers, fibroblasts, and leukocytes. And so again, we find this mostly in areas that need this supportive structure, such as within the lymphatic organs, of the spleen, the thymus, lymph nodes, and bone marrow. Dense connective tissue now is composed mostly of protein fibers and has less ground substance than loose connective tissue. The predominant fiber type that we find with dense connective tissue is collagen fibers. Now there are three types of dense connective tissue. The first is dense regular connective tissue, and this is where we find collagen fibers that are packed tightly together and are lined parallel so that they're able to resist applied force in one direction. So we find this within our tendons and ligaments, where the stress is applied just in one direction. Here we find very few blood vessels, and so when we have injuries to our tendons and ligaments, then it takes a while for this to heal because we need a rich blood supply to allow for exchange of waste material and nutrients to allow for good healing. The second type of dense connective tissue is dense irregular connective tissue. And this is where we have individual bundles of collagen fibers that extend now in all directions. And it is a very random pattern. There is no reason to its randomness. And because of this randomness, it allows for a supportive meshwork to occur. So we find this to be supportive and more tensile than the regular connective tissue. We find this in deep portions of the dermis, as well as a supporting layer around cartilage and a supporting layer around bone. And it also forms a thick fibrous capsule that supports and houses internal organs such as the liver, kidneys, and spleen. And then the last type is the elastic connective tissue, which is a type of dense connective tissue. And so this is where now we find branches of elastic fibers and has more fibroblasts than loose connective tissue, in addition to collagen fibers as well. So this allows for resilience and the ability to deform and then return to normal shape after being subject to stress. We find this within our vocal cords, the suspensory ligaments of the penis, as well as some ligaments within the spinal column. Also, we find wavy sheets of this found within the large and medium arteries, again allowing for stretching when we need those high volumes of blood to be pumped through those large and medium-sized arteries. So muscle tissue now are composed of specialized cells or fibers that respond to stimulations from the nervous system, where then they undergo internal changes that cause them to shorten, which then, the shortening of the muscle, will exert physical forces on other tissues and organs to produce movements. Some of these movements include voluntary motion of body parts, blood circulation, respiratory activities, propulsion of materials throughout the digestive tract, as well as waste elimination. So there are three main types of muscle tissue that we have. The first is skeletal muscle, and so the function of this is to move the skeleton, and this is where it is responsible for voluntary body movements, locomotion, as well as heat production. We find skeletal muscle attached to bones or sometimes to the skin, such as with the face, and also with voluntary sphincters, such as with our lips, our urethra, and our anus, once we get to the age of being potty trained with the last two. Next is the cardiac muscle, and so this is an involuntary muscle where we have contraction and relaxation that allows for pumping of the blood through the heart. We find this within the heart wall and is specific only to the heart. The third type is smooth muscle, where this too is an involuntary muscle that allows for movements and motions of material throughout internal organs. We find smooth muscle within the walls of hollow internal organs, such as blood vessels, respiratory airways, within the stomach, the bladder, and the uterus. Characteristics of these three types of muscle. With skeletal muscle, what we find are fibers to be long, cylindrical, striated, and so in this image, the striations that we see would be these lines. And so that's what it means to be striated in appearance, where that is just separation of each individual muscle unit. We'll talk more about that in future chapters. Fibers also tend to have multiple nuclei due to the high energy demands within the skeletal muscle. Next is the cardiac muscle, which these cells tend to be shorter than skeletal muscle. They are bifurcated, meaning that they branch off into Y shapes, such as with here. And then the connection is between these intercalcated discs that are specific only to cardiac muscle. They tend to have one or two centrally located nuclei within each individual cardiac muscle cell. And then finally, smooth muscle tend to have this spindle shape, where here is a good example of that. And these also tend to be shorter than skeletal muscle, and they only have one nuclei per muscle fiber. Nervous tissue is important for the transmission and transduction of information that can be used for us to process and to use. Characteristics of the two cell types of the nervous tissue are neurons and glia. And so here what we have is an image of a neuron that has this local cell body that has an extended cytoplasm into this axon and then into the dendrites. Where here is where we allow for synaptic communication between other neurons or other targets. So the function is to control bodily functions through the transmission of electrical impulses, such as to different types of muscles. Neurons are going to be the primary cells within the nervous tissue, where they are responsible for initiating and conducting the electrical impulses that are found throughout the body. We find neurons within the brain and spinal cord, where then they can have extensions to other targets, such as all the way down to our toes. Glial cells are going to tend to be much smaller, and so here is a picture of a glial cell, And their role is that they protect, support, and insulate neurons. Where there are over 10 times more glial cells than there are neurons due to the high demands, metabolic needs of neuronal cells. And so the location, again, is within the brain and spinal cord, which makes up the central nervous system, and anything outside of that, which we find within our nerves, makes up the peripheral nervous system. So some changes that can occur with aging tend to do with a change in cell size or number that we commonly find with aging process. So metaplasia is the first type where we find a conversion of the type of tissue. So going from pseudostratified cilia of our epithelial cells to a stratified squamous appearance. And so this would cause changes within our respiratory tract for individuals that have undergone long durations of smoking. Hypertrophy, this is where we have an increase in the size of a cell. So in contrast to hyperplasia, which is a change or an increase in number of cells. We can get both of these actually with skeletal muscle, where with high endurance exercise, we can get hypertrophy, so a bulk largening of muscle cells. And hyperplasia, we can actually insert more muscle cells within our body with certain types of exercises. Neoplasia is considered to be out of control growth and usually forms a tumor due to changes within stem cells, so such as our mesenchymal cells, may be a cause of excess growth of cells. And then lastly, what we can have is atrophy, and this is very common with aging, where disuse causes a shrinkage of the cell size or the cell number. And so that's why we see commonly smaller muscles in individuals of elderly people, as well as a decrease in number of bone cells or osteocytes within individuals that are aging.